Okay, so today we're going to be talking about creating a novel Bible. Now, some of you might have heard of it more as a story Bible, world building Bible. It goes by many names. I call it a novel Bible because a lot of people think world building Bibles are only for fantasy. That's not the case. World building Bibles are for anything that you want to write, whether it's historical fiction, regular fiction, science fiction. Heck, you could be writing a nonfiction book and it would still be very important. Um, the first thing that you want to take into account are main characters. So, with main characters, you definitely want these in your novel Bible. Now we'll backtrack a little bit. I want to make sure that I get this straight. A novel Bible is where you keep track of all the information that is important to your novel that you may or may not forget in the past. Now you might think, oh, of course I'll remember what my main character looks like. I have professionally edited some novels and had people say, oh, their hair's red. And I'm like, you said it was blonde 2 chapters ago. So you might think you'll remember, but it's important that you actually write it down because inevitably you're going to forget something. We're fallible people, we're not perfect, and that's okay. That's what the novel Bible's for, or the story Bible. So, you're going to want to make sure that you have your main characters because there are loads of details, especially if you have really good in-depth main characters. There are going to be tons of details to keep track of. Don't keep track of everything, just the important things. That being said, with main characters, what are the main things you need to keep track of? How they look. Now, I already mentioned that, but it's important to keep track of physical characteristics. So the main physical characteristics that I would say are the most important that people are going to really notice are things like hair, eye color, skin tone, and then any specific like birthmarks or scars. That is going to be the main focus. Oh, also last one, body type. Because all of these are going to change how the story looks if you change how the main character looks. If you change their hair color, the person's going to be like, whoa, that's wild. Unless they have naturally changing hair color, in which case you might want to explain that up front. And be like, their hair color changes every 3 days or whatever. Eye color is also something that's very important. Again, unless they have a changing eye color, which you need to stipulate up front, that is going to be important to know too. Why does their eye color change? Why does their hair color change? If those are things that are happening, you need to make sure you write them down. Do they diet every day? Does it change with their emotions? Does it change with the weather? You know, those things are all important to write down. Skin tone is also very important, especially because generally that is going to dictate what cultural background they're from, right? I don't know about you, but generally when you look at someone and they are of a certain skin tone, you think, oh, cool, they are African American, or they are Latino, or they are, fill in the blank cultural background. And that's fantastic. Love cultural diversity, super important to have in your book, but you don't want to be changing that and shifting that around all the time. So it's important that you remember what that is. Birthmarks and scars. You may think that your reader won't remember a birthmark or a scar, but they will. Especially if it's important to the plot, they'll remember. Body type. This is a very important thing because if they are imagining the main character as looking super skinny and then you say they lose weight, you're like, oh crap, they're like stick thin skinny. But if they were originally kind of a little bit more on the curvy side, and then they say they lose weight, you're like, oh, okay, so this is just indicating that they are sad or that they are having a hard time or that maybe they are anxious, and so it feels different. One is like danger, they might be dying, and the other one's like, oh, it's showing that their emotional state is in turmoil, or various things like that, right? For example, I believe the book Ready Player One. It's kind of dark. Wouldn't recommend it to necessarily your guys' age, but Ready Player One actually has a bit where he actually gets really, really depressed because the girl that he had a crush on doesn't like him, and so he starts binge eating junk food and gains a lot of weight. And so if we didn't already know what the character looked like, we'd be like, okay, so he gained a lot of weight. I don't know what he looked like before, so that doesn't change what I think now. So it's important to have a baseline that you're starting from. All right, next is names. There we go. That N looks so wonky. All right, obviously it's important to remember names. I don't need to state why, but if they have a full name, you gotta make sure you write it down because you probably will only ever use their first name. Most people don't even know the last name of most characters, unless it's a British novel, in which case, for some reason, everyone calls each other by their last names. Don't know why that's a thing. Anyway, but in general with names, you probably won't know their last name, and if you do know their last name, it's important that you remember it. I always call my main characters by their first names, and then later, when I introduce the last name, I'm like, shoot, I don't remember what their last name is. Later, like halfway through the novel, and then I have to go look it up, which is always a pain. So it's good to just write it down in some sort of separate thing. All right, next thing with your main characters is relationships. And I don't just mean the romantic kind. I also mean, like, do they have a good relationship with their dad? Do they have a bad relationship with their dad? Do they have a great relationship with their mom? Is their mom kind of a jerk? These are all important things to note, especially because that is going to change how the main character acts, right? If their mom is a jerk, then they're probably going to have issues with women because of the fact that they're the only most important woman in their life is a jerk. That would be problematic. So it's important to keep tabs on those kinds of relationships with your main characters. All right, the last one that I think is important is secrets. If your main character has a secret, make sure to write it down, especially because of the fact that you know what the answer is, but the audience doesn't. So if you say, haha, I have a secret, and then you forget what the secret is, and then you're like, I don't know what to write here anymore, that's going to be a problem. So it's important that you write those things down. All right, moving on to the next thing to keep track of. All right, your novel Bible, for some reason that's a tongue twister. Your novel Bible is also a great place to put places. Funnily enough. Now, with places, you're going to want to make sure you have the name of the place. Especially if you're doing a fantasy universe or a science fiction universe, you're probably going to make up some really cool country name. You got to make sure you remember those really cool country names and city names and etc. Now, if it only has one place or if it's a historical fiction novel, I would still say write those things down just because of the fact that you want to make sure you're staying in the right area. For example, if you're like, I'm writing a historical fiction novel about the Berlin Wall, and then you're suddenly like, they went from East Berlin to West Berlin. Those are two drastically different places back then. So as a result, you need to make sure that you know what the names are, where they're starting, where they're trying to go, anything important like that with regards to names. All right, next with places is government. If you have any sort of interesting governmental ties, you're going to want to make sure you write those things down. Are they friends with the mayor? Do they know the mayor? Is the mayor a jerk or not? Is there not even a mayor? Is it some sort of aristocracy and there's some sort of feudal lord that's over them all? That's also important to know. Next thing you're going to want to note is important figures. Now, this may be a political figure or may not be a political figure. Political figures generally are more importance, but sometimes in places there might be a local celebrity, right? It's like, oh my gosh, everyone knows so-and-so, they're a Hollywood star, but they live here. That actually happens a lot, where Hollywood stars will travel to Hollywood to do movies, but they'll live in another state. So generally, it's important that you write those things down. Are there celebrities that live there? If there are, what are they like? If there's not a celebrity that lives there, then who is the most important person in town? They can be a super big person, or they can just be, the most popular guy on the high school campus. It all depends on what you're going with your story. All right. Last bit is connections. All right. Now, obviously, there's more than this you can add to places, but these are the absolute bare minimum basics that we're going over today. Connections are really important. So, for example, if you're creating a world, let's say you have a big blobby continent here, and you're like, this is the place where they start, and they're headed this direction, and they go through this country, and then they get to this country over here. And then you later name this country a different thing, that's going to be problematic. People will notice. You may not think they will, but they will. there are some people who won't notice, but then there are other people, like in Brandon Sanderson's novels, where they'll be like, did you know that you did this and that in this one novel? And Brandon's like, yes. Did I? Like, I have no idea. So, I'll be honest, as a writer, that's why the novel Bible is really important, because if you don't keep track of those things, later someone's going to mention it and you're going to go, yes, I remember that. Do I? And that's going to cause problems, especially if it is important to the plot. So I would say if you have a map, whether it's a historical fiction novel, a physical fiction novel, etc., draw a basic map. You don't have to draw a huge map, but draw a map of where your story's taking place. It can even be the simplest map ever, like this is place, blah. This is other place, blah. They swim across ocean, ta-da. It doesn't have to be fancy, but as long as it makes sure that later, when you add on to the world, you're not confusing yourself. All right, or the readers, by consequence. You don't want to confuse the readers. The readers will be upset at you, and then you'll be sad, and then they'll be sad, and that's not good. All right, next is magic. Now, your novel may not include magic, so I also said / family trees, because those are two things that can commonly be important in novels that are drastically different. So you have magic and family trees, but the reason I have them together is because they're both important to the novel and complicated, which is part of the reason you need to write them down. All right, so list of spells, if there are spells, or potions. I should say / potions. And then over here, obviously, you have people. So, with your family tree, now not all of you will obviously write a novel that includes family tree, but some of you might need one. I know there have been romance novels that I've read where they're like, and now his brother is in the second book, and I'm like, he has a brother? So it's kind of important that you have those family trees so that way the reader's aware of what the family dynamic is. As for magic, it's really important that you have your spells and potions nailed down, because honestly, most readers will not keep track of that. But every once in a while, you will get a crazy happy fan who's just like, I know all of the names of all the Harry Potter spells and what they do. And you're just like, that's cool for you. So it's important as a writer that you make sure the spells are all straight and that the potions are all straight, because most people won't notice. But those that do, it's important that you keep that high quality. And to keep that high quality, you need to write down all the spells and all the potions that you use. Now, do you have to write them all down from the beginning? Absolutely not. Part of the fun of a novel Bible is making it as you go. You can be like 5 chapters in and then be like, I'm adding a friend, Stephen. Add Stephen to your family tree. And then if there's anything important about Stephen, like Stephen is secretly the father of so-and-so, write that down too. That's important. Then let's see what else. Strengths and weaknesses for spells are super important. And then for these people, important and least important people are going to be really important to mention. Because sometimes you might mention someone like the maid named Millie, but then the maid named Millie dies in the next chapter. So she wasn't super important, but she was important enough to mention, right? Or you might have a super important person where it's Sir Percival III, and he's like, the man of the manor, and so you need to know who he is. That's important to write down. So you gotta make sure you keep track of the most important and least important people. All right, last thing is functional magic. So for example, if you need to sacrifice a goat every time you do your magical spell, you should probably write that down. Or if your magical spell works by some sort of soul crystal that they wear around their neck, that's also important to note. And then if there's someone who works without a soul crystal, why? How do they do it? How does that magic work? And then for these guys, relationships. This is when it gets fun, when you can, for the family tree, when you could do like so-and-so married so-and-so and had 3 daughters, and those daughters, and you can go into the crazy stuff. All those family drama things. Ooh. And the magic, this is also, in my opinion, where it gets fun, because then you get to talk about how the magic functions. And then you get to talk about, hey, this magic does this. You don't, again, have to know this from the beginning. For example, right now, I'm currently working on a novel, and I have no idea how the magic functions right now. I just know it does. And so I just keep writing down, here's what it's done so far, and then when I figure it out, I'm going to write down what it is, but I don't know yet. And that's okay. You don't have to know all the answers. Just make sure you write down the important details, so that way if you have to fix it later, you can go back and fix it later. Granted, if you have a good enough editor, they should be able to fix that, but it's better to have it put together in the beginning, because of the fact that that is actually something that traditional publishers will reject you for, is not having a magic system or a family that is concrete. If they're starting to notice, like, oh, you said Steve was the second brother, but now I'm noticing there's another second brother named Oscar. Unless you can explain that, they're probably going to not take your book, unfortunately. A lot of people say, oh, well, that's what they have editors for. True, but they also have 100 manuscripts to go through, and 25 of them only can be accepted. Which means those that are, unfortunately, have a few flaws are going to get tossed. It's rough business writing. It's rough. Same thing with the magic system. I actually had I hate horror. Let's specify this. I hate horror. I was working with a company, though, that published dark fantasy. I don't mind dark, creepy. Horror, though, that's where I draw the line. I'm kind of weird like that. And there was someone who submitted a horror novel. It was a dark fantasy novel, but by all terms and purposes, it was a horror fantasy novel. And I actually loved it. It was the first horror novel that I've ever actually wanted to keep reading, because the character was so compelling. But unfortunately, the publishing company that I was interning with at the time had to reject it because I had too many little quirks and flaws within that first 10 chapters. And so as a result, out of the, I want to say 30 submissions that we got, we could only take 10. And so I ended up getting cut, which made me so sad. I was like, come on, this book is amazing. But they didn't take it. So that's why it's important to have your novel Bible, because with your novel Bible, you can avoid having some of these quirks and mistakes that are going to occur naturally, just because you're a person and you have flaws. Welcome to the human race. But unfortunately, when it comes to submissions, they don't have a lot of time, and so they have to axe it somehow, which I think is tragic and sad. But that is part of the reason you want to make sure you keep track of your magic or your family trees or where you're going and things like that. All right, next. Something you can put in your novel Bible but isn't necessary is the plot. Now, when I say the plot, some of you are probably thinking, oh, hold on, I'm not a plotter, so why should I put my plot in here? Hold on. If you are not a plotter, if you are someone who just writes to your heart's content and figures it out when you get there, that's fine. But generally, those kinds of people still have scenes in your head, right? Scenes that are like, oh, I can't wait to write this scene, you know, when they stab them in the back. Betrayal! Write that down. That's still part of your plot. Write those scenes down and be like, I have an idea for a scene later where so-and-so finds out that so-and-so's a vampire. Write that down. That's important. So even if you don't have a plot and you're not a plotter, you can still have a plot page where you have various scenes, various tidbits, various ideas. It can look as crazy and sporadic as you want it to, as long as you have a place where they're all written down. Especially because then if you don't use them later, that's great. But if you do use them later and you're like, oh no, I think I forgot this scene, you have a place to refer back to find that scene again. In this case, I will say make sure that you organize your documents well, because if you lose your novel Bible, that will be a problem. Or if you're writing it in a notebook, make sure you always put your notebook in the same place, that kind of stuff. If you are a plotter, make sure you write it out and alter any changes. Now, I will say it doesn't matter if you are a plotter. most plotters inevitably have their character go, ha, I'm going to change that about halfway through the plot. Not everyone does, but I will say a high percentage of authors will be like, I have my novel perfectly plotted, and then, halfway through the plot, they're like, meow, and you're like, where are you going? Where are you going? Come back! As they run away with your plot. So that being said, any changes that occur, make sure to write those down in your notebook. If you have your nice handy dandy little plot written out and it looks all pretty, and then your things change, you can rewrite it and be like, okay, I don't know where it's going, but it changed about here. Those are all important things to write down to make sure that you know where it's going, especially because the first draft will never be perfect. So when you look over the second draft, you could always, revise things. Be like, ooh, now I need to add in foreshadow for this one event. Funnily enough, most famous authors don't add in foreshadow in the beginning. Some do, but not a lot, actually. Brandon Sanderson doesn't. I don't think Jennifer Nielsen does. I know there's more than that, but that's at least two. There's a lot of people who are just like, I'm going to write it, and I think I know what the plot is, and then halfway through they're like, ooh, yes. And they need to fix that later, and that's fine. Honestly, it's important that you allow some change and don't keep your novel too strict, just because sometimes a great idea comes along later and you don't plan for it, and that's okay. If you're a planner, I know that might hurt your feelings, but it's okay to let it go and keep going. All right. Next thing, if you are doing any sort of science fiction, you're going to want to make sure you write down your tech. And even if you're not doing a science fiction, if you're doing a paranormal, or if you're doing a historical fiction, you're going to want to make sure you write down your tech. Especially if you're doing a historical fiction, you want to make sure that you're not randomly pulling out an AK-47 in the 1800s. That would be a problem. You got to make sure it's consistent. So the things you're going to want to write down with your tech are terms. So if they're called by any other name or nickname, then you got to make sure that you write that down. You got to make sure you list their uses. Not all technology is used for one thing. There are a lot of multi-use tools, right? And then last thing, importance to the scene/plot. Because of the fact that sometimes we get a little carried away. We as writers get carried away. I feel this so hard. I actually had a client I was working with who there was a mermaid in her original draft, and I was like, oh, I love this mermaid. She's the best. But then her only purpose in the plot was pretty much just to have a cool thing that the character could go do and save her. That was about it. And we were like, darn, that actually doesn't really add to the story much, considering it's a Cinderella retelling. Having her randomly save a mermaid doesn't really fit. Speaking of which, that is a published novel. You can look at it. It's called Beneath the Cinders. It's very sweet. Love the Cinderella retelling. It's cute. But it didn't have any importance to the plot. So that's important to acknowledge with all of your stuff. Does it have importance to the plot? The first draft, don't worry about importance to the plot. But second or third draft, you might want to start looking at, hey, does this serve the plot? Because if it doesn't, unfortunately, it might have to go. But on the bright side, that means you now have bonus material, and let me tell you right now, readers love that stuff. Bonus material, Brandon Sanderson has like pages and pages of bonus material, and let me tell you, everyone loves it. Bonus material is not a bad thing. So write to your heart's content, and if you need to delete later, count it as your bonus material. Just copy paste it to a different doc and be like, bonus promotional material, yeah. And consider yourself pat on the back. It's good. All right. Next. Yep. Oh, here we go. Is words. Oh, that is terrible handwriting when I'm sitting down. All right. If you have a fantasy language or new science fiction terms, you got to make sure you write it down here in your novel Bible. Anytime that you're like, I just made up a word, make sure you write that down, because you are probably not going to remember that word, or at least I don't. Maybe you guys have amazing memories that are like, poof, I remember my whole fantasy language. That is amazing for you. Most people do not have memories like that. So I would say write down your words. And then write down your definition. Make sure that you have an extensive definition too. Even if you don't know the definition right now, write down as much as you know. Even if you don't know at all, just what you do know. Do you know that it's a big smelly monster that smells particularly bad, and so it's considered a curse word if you call someone that, because it's really rude? Or is it that it's a technological term, and that if you say the full name, then you're supposed to be smarter because no one remembers the full name? I don't know. These are just ideas I'm throwing out there. Alright, if you have different languages for different places, you want to make sure that you write down the languages and their corresponding places. So for example, it could be easy in some cases where it's dwarves and dwarvish and elves and elvish, but some people get really crazy in depth and they're like, it's Gwakishibidibidin and it's for the Tani tribe. And it's like, cool, never gonna remember that. So you gotta make sure you write it down so you can remember it later. And if you need to, you can fix any errors that come up with that. Best way to fix errors in post, finishing your short story or novel, I would say Control F and then fill in the language, and then just make sure everywhere that you read it, it doesn't have any glitches or problems where you say the wrong thing. But then again, that is again something you do at the end. You write this during, then you fix it later. Don't edit during. Now I know some people, they have to edit during because otherwise they don't move forward. I get that. But I would say most people, that's not the case. Most of the people start beating themselves up so badly during the editing process that they don't keep writing. They give up. Which is sad. Because of course it's going to be rough in the first draft. Everyone has a bad first draft. I'm a professional editor and I have a bad first draft. We all do. Honestly, I've never seen a first draft that is perfect. Never. If you have seen one, call me. I'm curious. But I've never seen a perfect first draft. Long story short, if you have languages or new words or new terminology, make sure you write them down. And don't worry about fixing it until later, but once you get to that point, feel free to look into it. Alright. Last thing that you can do, just for fun, these are fun things that you can add to your to your novel Bible. You don't have to add these things, but they can be fun. You can add character photos. If you have any sort of AI generator, or if you have any sort of you find a fun art thing online and you're like, yes, they totally look like that random character that someone drew. Or if you have a moment where you're like, I think they look kind of like this character from this cartoon. You can do that too. I will say though, if you do use AI art, make sure that you only use it as inspiration later, because of the fact that it is important to support actual artists when you go to publish your actual novel. But by all means, use AI art to have your character photos in your novel Bible. No one will care. And if it helps you move forward, that's all the better. If you want, as I said earlier, have a map. You don't have to have a super elaborate map. It can just even, like I said, be a bunch of X's and O's and scribbles. As long as you can understand it, have a map. That can be really fun. Another thing that I would say is feel free to doodle on the sidelines in this notebook, or if it's a Google document, feel free to comment in the sidelines and be like, yes, one of my favorite novel Bible things that I've seen from one of my other friends was she was re-editing her thing and someone was reading over it and was like, yes, the aforementioned library sips tea. Because they thought it was so fancy that they said aforementioned instead of just the library. And so as a result, you can doodle in the sidelines, you can comment in the sidelines. Just have fun with it. Ultimately, the novel Bible is there to help you. And if you're not having fun with it, then don't do it. The whole process of the novel Bible is supposed to be helpful and fun. It's not supposed to be just one or the other. Alright, do you guys have any questions about novel Bibles? World building, etc.? Not really? No? Okay, that's okay. I just figured I'd ask. Alright, this lesson is shorter than usual. Normally it's up to an hour, 45 minutes to an hour, but today I decided to go with a concept that I wasn't sure whether or not it would be longer or shorter. So if there's anything you'd like to ask me, feel free to ask me. Heads up, we are going to be having a Valentine's Day contest. Now the reason I put it in quotation marks is because this Valentine's Day contest isn't very serious, you see. The concept for the Valentine's Day concept is that you have to have two characters going on a date. But it doesn't have to be romantic. It can be a best friend date. It can be a romantic date if you want it to be. Or it can be one of the characters thinks it's a date, but then it turns out it's not a date and they're really a secret spy. You can do whatever you want with this one, as long as it involves the word date and two characters. I don't care beyond that. Go wild, go crazy, have fun with it. Those entries will be due on Leap Day, funnily enough, because it's the last day in February. So the 29th of February by 8:45 p.m. You have till then to write it. By all means, like I said, go nuts with it, have fun. And if you ever want me to edit it, feel free to just send it to me. Give me quick, at least give me a week before the deadline. But otherwise, I'd be more than happy to help you guys with it. But yeah, so that's the February contest that's going to be coming up in a few days. Alright, I'm going to turn the video off.